The Russian Civil War is often oversimplified to a struggle between the monarchist whites and communist reds. However, there were many more factions than just those two, and even within the whites and the reds, there were many different smaller factions which made them up, which were often at odds with each other. The main support base for the Bolsheviks when they took power in October 1917 was to be found in the industrial cities like Petrograd, present-day St. Petersburg, and Moscow. However, even this support base was sometimes a bit shaky for the communists because of shortages which then led to strikes. However, for the most part, the workers were loyal to the communists. There were also the mutineers and specifically the sailors of the Kronstadt and Baltic Sea fleets. The Kronstadt mutineers would actually later go on to rebel against the Bolsheviks and Lenin's uncompromising authoritarian leadership approach, because many of the Kronstadt sailors were actually anarchists. When Kerensky's provisional government disastrously decided to continue Russia's participation in the First World War following the February Revolution, the result was the Sovietization of the army and mutinies in which the officers were killed. Those soldiers who defected to the Bolshevik cause wore red armbands to distinguish themselves from those who were still loyal to the Tsar. Although the Bolsheviks would later go on to dramatize the storming of the Winter Palace, in reality there was actually very little resistance. Now, you would think that one of the most persecuted groups under the Tsar would be very keen to support the Bolshevik cause, also a group which saw little in the way of land reform under the provisional government, and that was the peasantry. Although Lenin did promise land reform, his treatment of the peasantry with the food detachments confiscating surplus grain and livestock alienated the peasantry. The Bolshevik view of the peasantry was basically that they were an archaic leftover of Tsarist Russia who would exist only to feed the cities and would then fade away into non-existence. The White Army was a real combination of different people with different political ideologies. On the right wing of the White Army, you had the ultra-reactionary officers and cadets. On the left wing of the White Cause, you had the Mensheviks, moderate socialists who opposed the Bolshevik Party and proclaimed Lenin's takeover in October as illegal, and the socialist revolutionaries, who in turn were split between the left and right socialist revolutionaries. Now, as you can imagine, the monarchist, czarist, imperialists did not get on very well with the moderate socialists, and vice versa. Additionally, you had the Cossacks. Now, the Cossacks were also divided amongst themselves. The older generation of Cossacks tended to be more conservative. The younger generation, many of whom had served on the front line of the Eastern Front in the First World War, were more left-leaning. However, the terrible, horrendous behaviour of Red troops in Cossack territories alienated the population, as happened with the peasantry, into being opposed to the Bolsheviks. And the Cossacks in the Don, Kuban and Terek regions even proclaimed their own republics and re-established their old Cossack governments. As the Cossacks had been a privileged military class under the Tsar, the Bolsheviks basically thought they were Tsarist lackeys, people who had been oppressing the ordinary workers of Russia for generations and therefore should be liquefied. So the Bolsheviks launched a policy of de-Cossacization. They would go into Cossack settlements, set up revolutionary tribunals, sentence men, women and children to death for anti-communist activity. When the volunteer army was forced back through the Kuban region to the Crimea, many of the Don Cossacks and Kuban Cossacks, both soldiers and civilians, attempted to be evacuated with the white soldiers. Many Cossack emigres would return during the Second World War, eager to inflict revenge on the Soviet regime, which had so ruthlessly persecuted them. And there were even Cossacks who fought among the mass-murdering SS. Kuban Cossack leader Shkuro was among those executed in Moscow following the surrender of the Cossacks, or the betrayal of the Cossacks at Lienz by the British to the Soviets. The Blacks were anarchists in Ukraine, led by Nestor Makhno, who is the sort of father of anarchism or anarcho-communism. He established free Soviets. At times, the Makhnovists, the anarchist blacks in Ukraine, were fighting with the Reds, at other times they were fighting against them, and also against the National Army of Ukraine, which was trying to assert Ukrainian independence with the support of occupying Central Powers forces. The Machnovists did commit many atrocities, including the massacre of the Mennonites, who were a Germanic group that lived in Ukraine. The Greens were essentially peasant rebels. They did not have a clear, coordinated structure or any good leadership. They were simply the result of the Reds and the Whites' mistreatment of the rural population. The Reds brutally crushed all of these peasant uprisings, sometimes even using chemical weapons to do so. The peasants sometimes resisted the Red food detachments and reprisals by slitting open the bellies of Red soldiers and stuffing them with grain to mock the Reds' efforts to confiscate their grain. In March 1918, Lenin negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans. This ceded vast swathes of Eastern and Central Europe, former territories of the Russian Empire, to Germany, who then fought to defend these territories from communist takeovers. In Finland, there was a civil war between the Reds and the Whites, the legacy of which is still a source of bitterness. In the Baltic, there were fierce wars of independence involving German Freikorps, British, various Scandinavian volunteers, and of course the native Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians, some of them fighting for the Reds, some of them fighting for national independence. So it was all a very chaotic, confused mess. Ultimately, the Red Army was successful in defeating its opponents because of the fragmented nature of its enemies, and also the brilliant but brutal leadership of Trotsky.